Is this just a sewing project?
Contrary to the hemline index, which posits the theory that the stronger the economy, the shorter the hemline and vice versa, the Micro Mini has once again reared its non-existent rear during one of the worst economic downturns since the last really bad one. That is to say, that it appears that neither the fashion zeitgeist nor the economy have our backsides covered. But alas, after spending the best part of 2022 avoiding this inevitable resurgence, it was finally time to explore my stance on the trend. To mark the unrelenting return of Fashion Month, I'll be crocheting and knitting a micro miniskirt from last year's catwalk.
We take slow fashion very seriously on this channel.
My inspiration, the viral Miu Miu Micro Mini Chino skirt. If that doesn't sound like a limited edition coffee order in a late stage capitalist society, then I don't know what does. This project is essentially the butt of a bad joke that I committed to a little more than I perhaps should have. Will it be worth it? Honestly, I can't even bear to think about it. Yet again, I will be using a fine sports weight cotton yarn in the stoniest beige because chino adjacent skirts deserve no more and no less. I chose to crochet the main skirt because the original 12 fabric has a structure to it that I likely won't get as easily by knitting. That being said, the pockets will be knit to more closely resemble the lining fabric in terms of drape. I thought about just using the single or even the half double crochet stitch, and although both would work, the waistcoat stitch, more commonly known as the crochet knit stitch, seemed like the better option. After all, it would suit the knit pockets more. Funnily enough, this would also mean that like the design of the skirt itself, the very stitch pattern would also look like something it isn't. How meta. But I digress. This was the first time I'd used it for anything more than a swatch, and let's just say that some practice beforehand wouldn't have gone amiss. The first step was to obtain the perfect low waist measurement, and to say this felt unnatural after a decade of high-waisted bliss was an understatement. Eventually I began chaining and then added a few extra inches for the overlap. Following a couple of very long rows,
Listen to this.
it suddenly occurred to me that it was possible to crochet in the round instead, giving a neater finish altogether. And being unable to bear the thought of throwing away all that work, I proceeded in the round without frogging. And then the stars aligned in a way that looked an awful lot like self-sabotage. Due to my inexperience with this stitch, I unsurprisingly misplaced my hook a few times, and the only way to fix this was to start again. And after several more hours, this is what it looked like. For anyone wondering how to do this, you basically crochet into both sides of the chain to make a very, very long round. If Tommy has 6 apples and Joan has 8 lollipops, how long would it take to crochet a micro miniskirt using the waistcoat stitch? Since crocheting in the round did most of the work, I just crocheted the two sides together before moving on to the main body of the skirt. The fabric seemed a little tighter than expected at this stage. But what are red flags for, if not for ignoring? Now for the pleats. There weren't that many, but the mental gymnastics required were not insignificant. After marking the pleats, I added increases every other row or so. Sure, I could have thrown together a rough diagram, or even spent hours sampling each idea, but where would the fun be in any of that? Many more hours of crocheting later, my somewhat conservative increases didn't seem to be doing much, so I increased some more.
They look like noodles.
And with all things considered, it was going reasonably well. And right on time as always, disaster had struck, and the devastation was otherworldly. Emotionally, not so much. I mean, this is exactly what I signed up for, and it could be worse. But schedule-wise, it was not looking good. However, I did feel a sense of relief that I wouldn't have to continue with the charade any longer. Remember when I said that thing about the pleats not pleating enough? Well, now they were pleating way too much, and despite looking half decent flat, they looked really bad on the stand. But that's not all. The increases I added to shape the silhouette were also so excessive that the only word that comes to mind is embarrassing. I have a confession to make. My first mental draft for the skirt involved crocheting the panels separately instead of all together. Naturally, I wanted to avoid this because the thought of dealing with actual seams and extra yarn ends was off-putting to say the least. Nevertheless, given the aptitude of the failure I just had, it was worth a shot. To proceed, with caution, as I had already sunk the majority of my schedule into this first attempt, I decided to make a start on the skirt without the waistband. This meant that I could throw out the cork while keeping the champagne, because this was either going to end in a celebration or an epic drowning of sorrows. Why is the waistcoat stitch in half double crochet so much better in every way possible?
You're coming home with me.
So in the end, instead of crocheting in one piece from the top down, it made more sense to work in panels from the center front all the way around. This isn't to say that working from the top down was inherently flawed, because it was my execution that was the issue. What can I say? Excitement combined with the too much gene is a powerful concoction. With all that said, I really wanted to try this out, given that there was already something reasonably solid to fall back on. It's almost hilarious how much I underestimated this project. Crochet a miniskirt, they said. How long could it take? What could possibly go wrong? With further progress, my hope was gradually restored, and I genuinely felt like I had figured out the pleats. I only had to double check the fit on the stand, but why did it look so bad?
So far, I'm happy with how the pleats have turned out, but if I'm honest, it still doesn't look great on the stand. Okay, I'm definitely thinking about redoing the waistband just so that it matches the half double crochet. It could work. Let's stay optimistic.
It was at this point that I hit the proverbial wall, and I started to wonder if this was what being catfished felt like. There was still so much to do, so much that had already been done, and the reality of my failure was sinking in. Perhaps the best course of action would be to simply cut my losses and give up. Like miniskirts and leather upholstery, it just wasn't meant to be. After wallowing in self-pity for about half an hour, I decided it was worth continuing, because if I was going to disappoint with the end result, then I was going to give it my all and really disappoint. As Walt Disney once said, whatever you do, do it well. I was starting again. On the positive side though, I knew exactly what to change and how to change it, and that was a much needed plus. You see, I had changed my mind about a few things. Okay, many things, including the length, closure, and even the pleat spacing and depth. I had finally come to terms with the fact that what I initially considered to be a cute and quick sidekick to support my next project was actually exuding major main character energy. Nonetheless, I was now way too invested in this narrative, and the trials and tribulations, wins and losses so far, only made me look forward to achieving a more ideal result. As a quick side note, I had very limited yarn for this project because I initially got it for something else, and I wasn't sure if I even had enough to finish with. Only one thing was for certain, there were a lot of yarn ends to look forward to. I'll admit that my anti-nostalgia fueled fear of super miniskirts led to the sneaky addition of a couple of inches to the hem, so since I was now wholeheartedly committed to getting things right, why not
Push it to the limit.
Instead of the initial 4-button placket, it was going to be 3. I also had to make the pleats shallower because the ones I made already were covering too much of the panel behind them. If you're wondering why the pleats were so complicated, the short answer is that in order to make the seams look symmetrical, the construction had to be asymmetrical, which in turn meant falling into a giant right and wrong, left and right side rabbit hole rigmarole, which took forever to crawl out of. In layman's terms, this project was so not simple that it felt like a glitch in the simulation. Is it me? Am I the drama? I had only just finished the front of the skirt and still had 4 pockets to contend with. Speaking of pockets, it turned out that the ones on the Miu Miu skirts were what I can only describe as loosely functional. With this new discovery, it soon became clear that there was no way I could avoid replicating this functionality without rendering the entire project insufficient. So I cracked on. The back panels were relatively simpler. I just made sure to include pocket openings and a few short rows to make up for, well, you know, the garbage in the back of a van, or however it goes. The hardest part was probably working with the weird asymmetrical symmetry for both sides.
Is this just a sewing project?
For the new front closure, I crocheted a separate placket for the buttons, and I really liked how the whites gave a classic lining effect. I was working away from the stand a lot for this latter part of the skirt, and granted, things went awry a few times, but a lot of it could have been avoided with just being less distracted. So it turns out that my front left panel is too wide because I forgot to factor in this strip. And I'm really not sure that I want to frog and redo everything, so I might, and this may change, I might just fold it over and put this on top depending on how thick it is. If it's too thick, then I will frog and re-crochet everything again. I feel like I'm so close yet so far, but I'm liking the results so far, so hopefully. The latest version looked good flat, and okay if not a little disappointing on the stand. Nevertheless, there was still the majority of the fluff that had yet to be done to it, and I was really hoping the pockets would help to add some flair to the silhouette. It was tempting to just make the peekaboo pockets by attaching some strips to the hem, but the mere thought of pockets as useless as they were useful was pretty enticing. So I stuck with the original ones instead. Once the knitting was done, I then cast off with a crochet hook. This was super easy and I recommend it to anyone who isn't a fan of casting off with needles. Obviously the front and back pockets weren't the same, so I basically either used double pointed needles or circular needles. For the new waistband, I was going to use the same technique as before, except in the half double crochet waistcoat stitch. Since the placket turned out so well, I also wanted to incorporate a white band on the inside. Although this faux lining wouldn't be visible, it genuinely made the garment feel a little more authentic for me, and it wasn't that much of an extra bother. Now that every piece of the puzzle was complete, it was finally time to put them together. I started off by attaching the pockets to the pocket openings.
Oh, there it is.
The front pockets were more complicated in shape, but not that much more difficult to set in, which, at this stage, was a big relief. Next, I slip-stitched the panel edges together. Single crochet would have also worked, but the gap between the panels was significantly wider. Finally, I was left with one continuous strip for a skirt, and it was time to attach the waistband. I was really hoping that the stitch numbers matched, because other than human error, there was no reason for them not to. And they did. This was probably the best part of the project so far. But the crocheting wasn't over yet, because belt loops. And the true procrastination had finally met its end. There are few phrases more apt at describing this task, so let's just call a spade. Weaving in yarn ends is a necessary evil. Sure, the runway version of the skirt had frayed raw edges, and you could argue that simply trimming these yarn ends would be a forgivable, if not appropriate, design choice. But look at these ends and tell me that they don't disturb you, that you don't feel an innate sense of unease. I thought as much. After surviving the most mind-numbing, podcast-blasting couple of hours, the best part was finally approaching. Despite some minor adjustments I would make to it, this skirt has somewhat changed my mind about the Micro Mini. I have to admit, I really wasn't expecting this to turn out as well as it did, although that's not to say it's perfect. Without an additional pair of shorts, this piece will forever be doomed to a satirical existence. Anyway, I hope you enjoy this process, and make sure to join me for the next video, which will, in the words of the internet, make it make sense. Thank you so much for watching, and enjoy this clip show.